From my point of view, the show had run, I think at that point, for like 33 years. And I felt that it was not my position to try and change the chemistry, but just to improve and modernize, but also to cheerlead. I've never seen it as me being the person that controlled a show. So I wanted to make sure that, and I think Joe somehow and I bonded, but I really wanted to make sure that Joe felt that the show was an extension of what they created, and that we had taken their heritage and their success and then extended it into modern technology, modern ideas, the changes of culture.
I just felt like it was in good hands, and there wasn't any reason to worry about it. It was still an anthology. I think I would have been a little saddened if they had brought in some star. Everybody had a series, and ABC couldn't understand why I wouldn't have a star, you know. Everybody had one. But the thought of doing it with a star who would have a kind of control that I didn't want any actor to have was unacceptable.
I wrote a statement, a very emotional and passionate statement that included episode ideas, and handed it back to MGM and said, if you want it to go as an anthology, I will be your guy. If it wants to go the other way, I don't believe I should be the person to do it. And luckily, the management at that time handed that semi-Bible onto the guys at Showtime, and they all signed on. And we were able to basically bring back what Joe and his partner had been able to create.
Orbit is 4x4, and Starfield confirms this is Tau Gamma Prime.
I'm getting a data stream.
What's your assessment?
No radio spectrum emissions. It is an unspoiled planet with no signs of intelligent life.
Not for long.
And that was what I think an anthology show is you tune in to be excited every week and not to be harnessed to some kind of pair of horses that just go down the same traces.
I considered it a great compliment.
It's interesting to look at those episodes today because in some ways they're pioneering, in some ways they're unbelievably hokey, but the storytelling is at its heart so compelling, and even with the effects of the day being somewhat limited, there's some wonderful stories.
I didn't dictate ever, because I really felt that creativity doesn't come from dictation, it comes from emancipation. We really wanted people to speak through that kind of rare part of them that means that they're creating from their own nature. And frequently that means that you are making something that could be subversive. And we were open to scripts that paralleled our society, but used science fiction as a metaphor to get through to something that they believed impassioned and that they felt needed to be changed.
This gun was designed to fulfill a need. And you've got a need. It's written all over your face.
I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Sure you do.
The best kind of science fiction storytelling is really rooted in humanity. You want all the bells and whistles, you want the gee whiz factor and the wondrous science fiction affords, but in the end, it's the human stories that people can relate to that are grounded in emotions and humanity.
Dad, please promise me this is the end of it.
It was as if she was obsessed with the idea that I didn't love her, that I betrayed her.
What?
Those kinds of stories and the kind of twists that make them really powerful are a really important staple of the kind of stories we told on The Outer Limits.
I say capture, don't lecture. You don't want the show to become a polemic, a political statement. What you want to do is to be transported by the imagination of somebody. And if you learn a lesson, a little parable in that process, that's very cool.
You sit down at the typewriter at those days, or the computer today, and you say, what am I angry about? Now find that out and let's write something about it. And I was angry the whole Eisenhower era had been so suffocating and not unlike where we are today.
That wasn't quite the same process that we used. When I was working through the origination, I wrote 22 story ideas that were like little squibs, and they were really what provokes my imagination. That was my mentoring process. I felt that it was important to really emancipate the imagination with this show, to really allow writers and the directors to push their own creativity, because I felt if you're going to tune in and see something called The Outer Limits, it better be going as far out as we can create.
If I decided that this particular episode lended itself to a certain cinematic style, they went with it because, you know, that's kind of what they wanted from the show. So a lot of it was left up to the directors to create something that was really individual.
You could do anything you wanted to, and it was fun to guess, you know, are we going to end the world this week, or are we going to have a good one or a happy one? And so I don't think that exists outside of an anthology.
In Outer Limits it was different, because you never had any recurring characters whatsoever. So you have the opportunity to interpret. My goodness, a director interpreting on television, that is something that is not very, very usual.
And so I didn't put a rule on what was to be created, except that I really tried the hardest I could to get people to feel free to create. And I really made a contract with the cast and with the crew and with the creative team that if there were mistakes or if they screwed up because they were trying to be too imaginative, I would personally take the blame.
For me as a director, that's what made it so interesting, and I stayed with the show for 5 years. It was exhilarating to be able to be a director, you know, and to do stuff that in other shows you were never able to do.
We were making little movies, or thought we were, and certainly because there's a risk to that. When we succeeded, it was really strong.
It was their responsibility to take the risk of getting out there, and I really tried to create an environment that I would have felt personally, if I was working in it, would have made me feel free to keep trying to beat my own creativity.
It is so invigorating as a director to do, because you turn into a filmmaker all of a sudden. You're doing a television series, but the producers always expected us to be filmmakers.
It was like shooting a mini feature every week.
Because it was an anthology show, we didn't have this constant thread that we had to be true to every week. All we really had to be true to was the tone and keeping it science fiction. And Outer Limits had a very specific tone, which we were very careful to stick to.
And if I set the example of trying to put my faith in the group culture of this creative think tank, where people were welcomed to kind of contribute and open up, then it wouldn't be limited. And I think that the life of those shows, the amount of imagination in them, would be related to the way that they would live on in people's memories.
The arguments we had, the fights, again, not fights in the sense that, but the healthy arguing that we went through in the story phase, and the extreme care that was taken in the creating of the sets and the structure and the special effects. I wouldn't act differently if this was a multi-million-dollar movie.
And the magic of these shows is that if you think back, I can remember Zanty Misfits the first time it was on the air, and I was a little kid, scared the living daylights out of me. And that's the test, is was it so unique and powerful that you get it burned into your synapses? And that's what I wanted our shows to do.
I didn't invent the Outer Limits. That's the first thing. I'm very lucky. I was able to look at a series that had lived for 30-odd years and had run still and be on television in a way that very few series had managed to last. And I came at the process of looking at whether or not I could help to revive the Outer Limits by having a great deal of respect for the original creators, Leslie Stevens and Joe Stefano.
I first produced on the Outer Limits, which was a show that was co-created by Leslie Stevens and I. Actually, Leslie began it, and he was talking to ABC, and he had a show on, and they felt that he shouldn't produce another series. Of course, you would never hear anything like that today. You know, if you can produce 5, go ahead. But anyway, they wouldn't let him produce it, and so we had been friends from New York. He married a very dear friend of mine, as a matter of fact. And he called me one night, almost at midnight, and said he would like to come over. He said, I'll be there in 5 minutes. And we were getting ready for bed, I think. But anyway, he came over and told me that he had this show and that he had written the pilot script and that it was going to be filmed very soon, like the next week. And would I like to come in as a producer? And everybody was with William Morris, so there was no problems about that. And so I said, well, I'll have to read the script. And being his probably oldest friend in Hollywood, he got a little scared because he knew that I would be honest with him. So I said that as producer, I am ordering these changes. And luckily, it never hurt our friendship. We always felt the same, liked each other. And every once in a while, I miss him.
What was it inside a show that was so strong that people would continue to watch it 30 years later? And one of the things about The Outer Limits was that they were parables, that these stories were using aliens or monsters or atomic warfare in the same way people used hobgoblins and witches and dragons in earlier times to give people stories and messages about humanity.
We promised them that we would have a monster like this one in the pilot, that we would have something similar, some scary, very scary alien element in every show. But I was not a big science fiction fan. I like the Gothic. I like scary things like Val Lewton had been producing in the 30s. And so I combined the Gothic with science fiction. And it was quite a joy as time went on to find out how many different kinds of people I had communicated with. Because all the shows that I wrote and the ones that I rewrote and the ones that I ordered were in some way had something to do with what was going on at that time. We had just come out of the very dark 50s, which even I didn't realize were as dark as they were. And the whole thing about the CIA and all the stuff that was going on, just, you could not go to a network and say, I'd like to do a show about the CIA. No way you could do that.
This show is a reflection of the things that we are concerned about. And the great thing about the 60s series, and the thing that we wanted to make sure that we emulated, was that the 60s series was as much a reflection of that time as I'd like to think our show is a reflection of our time. If you looked at our show in 30 years, you would see, hopefully, a time capsule of the things that people at the turn of the century were concerned with, about genetics, about cloning, about drug abuse, about violence, about all of these things that we're worried about. We're not particularly worried about the Cold War anymore. We're not really, now we have a whole new set of concerns about violence on our home turf. But if you look at the 60s show, a lot of that show is about xenophobic, the Russians are at our back door. There's a lot of Cold War themes running through the original series, which is really cool to look at, but is not relevant to us today.
If you were going to take this show, you go back and do what the show was truly about, which was individual science fiction stories every week, a unique and different place to go, and that the imagination is the only thing that should rule.
In the 90s, I was contacted by MGM, and I came here for a meeting, and they talked about setting it up for television again and doing it pretty much the same way, and that Penn Densham was going to be one of the producers or executive producers, and that he had written a new version of what I called the canons of The Outer Limits, which was for writers.
So I wrote 22 little story ideas. so they could look at what a season would look like. And I presented that back, got a great deal of enthusiasm, scratched my head and said, okay, I guess I didn't do too badly. My partners and Mark were all involved in looking at what I was helping me create this. And we started to get the ball rolling. And it was a very exciting time. And one of the things that I wanted to do was also phone up Joe Stefano, who was around, I'd never met, and just talk to him. And I found out that a lot of the philosophies that I'd come up with were very similar to the philosophies he'd evolved when he was creating the original series, and that we were not really that far apart. Although the time was 30 years, we were still the same people with the same spirit, the same desire to explore, and the same desire to puncture sacred cows. And it was a great emotional journey just to discover these things.
Every new show has a Bible, and that's what they're called today. I was once criticized for calling them canons, but after that they became known as Bibles. And it's just the way you sell the show, as well as the pitch, the vocal pitch that you give. You must have the Bible. And I felt very good. I had seen one thing that Penn had done, that he had directed. And I just knew that he was right for the show. I didn't know the other gentlemen who were in his company, but it seemed to me that they were the right people. And I came on the show as a consultant, creative consultant, and they would send me scripts, and I would make notes, or just kind of generally approving, because I felt like these had had a lot of work put in them.
We were very, very cognizant in making this series or reinventing it of our legacy, and of holding true to that, the idea of doing something that's scary and provocative and timely and relevant.
We were very, very careful to select a very minimal number of stories that we felt had stood the test of time and really deserved to come back because they still made a really high impact for today's audience. And Feasibility Study was Joe Stefano's script, a personal piece he'd written himself, and one of those things that ends with such a profound feeling that people are willing to die for the sake of other human beings to live, which is a joyous and poignant and, in a way, very scary but very noble feeling. And so we were able to remake Joe's story, with Joe writing the script again and asking David McCallum, someone who'd been with the original series, to come back and join us. And my great pleasure was taking Joe up to the set and letting him see his words be captured on film, and being with him and just sharing the time of a man who had written Psycho for Hitchcock and who had a brain that was still as alive as anybody's, and spending time with a man who I really felt had pioneered a world-breaking science fiction show that we were then inheriting the benefits of.
It was interesting because I was on the set all the time while we were shooting that. And the day I arrived, they had just started shooting, and there was David McCallum, who had been in two of the best first Outer Limits. Now he was in this one. And we just looked at each other and hugged, and it was like no time had gone by at all. And I loved working with Penn. He's so creative, and he has this way of switching on to whatever you're talking about and giving it the same juice that he would be giving to something of his own. I must tell you this, that I got letters from very young people, 11, 12, 13, saying that they loved my show because the monsters weren't all bad. And I felt, so in other words, sometimes their parents say, you little monster, stop doing that. And now here was a show that was saying, well, it's not all bad to be a monster. And it was an immediate success with teenagers and very young people. And it was quite a joy as time went on to find out how many different kinds of people I had communicated with.
Most writers that came into the show did not understand the difference between The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone, and they were constantly pitching Twilight Zone stories to us. And there really is quite a difference between the two. And it's a tonal thing that's very hard to communicate. One difference is that The Outer Limits is science fiction. It's not fantasy. You know, we don't have 5 people, you know, that turn out to be toys in a box. That's not science fiction, that's a fantasy. So everything needs to be something based on science that could possibly happen, you know, tomorrow or 100 years from now.
We wanted to do just a straightforward, scary, Fatal Attraction-like show, which this obviously is. And again, a lot of the things we were experimenting with first season was finding established forms like a Fatal Attraction thriller, sexy, you know, love triangle type story. Many other types of forms, a Western. There were things that we were trying to do and then apply them to science fiction because we really wanted to explore the various ways that you can look at science fiction and other forms through the filter of science fiction.
It's supposed to be a story about a robot who appears to be a real woman. So how do you sell to an audience that she's really a robot when she's supposed to be such a good robot that she looks like a real woman? So we decided, and then the cliche in older television would be you open a little trap door in her head and there's some circuits in there and it's obviously kind of raised out from her head. We said we're not going to do that, we're going to do it better than that. So we came up with the idea of opening the back of her head. And even that I was afraid was going to look like that trap door thing. So the visual effects guy, John Gadecki, and I sat down and he said, well, we could do this motion control. It's never been done before, but we can do it. And I said, John, can we do it? Are you sure this will really work? And it was a big gamble. It took half a day to shoot it. And on a 7-day shooting schedule, a half a day is pretty valuable just to shoot one shot. But we did it, and I think it sells, it's right off the beginning of the show, it sells that she's actually a robot, and the rest of the show you believe it. And, you know, the actress was very good at playing a robot, so that helped also. She sold it, I think.
The visual effects on Valerie 23 were a great combination of taking filmic techniques that we had used with like motion control and applying them to television format. And that a lot of times you just don't have the time or money for that. And John Gadecki was the supervisor for that episode. His big argument on designing the effect was that the head would have been more dramatic if it becomes concave and you go into the head while there's a face there, not just sort of add an appliance and take away kind of thing. So with the motion control and putting her head in a brace, you could do one pass with a dummy head, really do the dipstick thing, because that's what the gag is. You know, you go right into with this sort of thing that reads out what's going on, and there's a screwdriver and all that, and then when you composite and do the split screen with the motion control, the second pass of the live action, you get freaked out because there she is talking away and she looks very real, and it all works. It's effective. I know that if you watch her ear, there's a little bit of bobbling on her ear that they never quite got out. It was kind of down to the wire, and they did the best they could, but still, it was a pretty breakthrough for them and for television.
When I was a kid, I used to eat science fiction. I used to love that stuff and ate as many books as I could get my hands on. It was a story I'd never seen before, and it was so simple. It was a man who was incapable of movement, and someone had built a robotic companion for him. And what did that mean? Because in order to understand what humanness was, one would not be able to create a robot companion unless that companion could relate to us through our own needs and knowledge base. And so the story actually extended itself all the way through into actually being a companion to have sex with, which was a novel and very innovative idea, and something that no television channel other than Showtime, who had taken off the limits, who had said, no, your stories can go wherever they need to go. We were able to do something with nudity, but with a profound purpose.
Actually, one of our only full frontal shots of a woman in our show, and that caused a certain amount of debate and discussion. Again, it was our first season. We wanted to push the envelope in terms of Showtime. We didn't want it to be gratuitous. We wanted to do something that we never wanted our sex or violence or language to be gratuitous on this show. But on the other hand, we didn't want to be limited by it. As it served the story, we wanted to use it. So I think that it did serve the story. It was a really interesting shot, and it kind of became one of the jokes for us. I think she says something like, I'm fully functional or something, and it's like, it kind of became a little of the inhumor in that series. But it was a good show at the end of the day.
One of the joys of running the Outer Limits was sometimes just seeing the extraordinary creativity that people had. And sometimes that didn't come from being florid and ambitious. It came from pure simplicity. And Quality of Mercy that Brad Wright wrote was a lesson, I think, to all of us.
I'm not done yet, so come on!
First of all, it's the only idea I have ever had as a writer that came to me all at once, and I put it on a piece of paper. And I literally wrote it down in like 10 lines in pencil. And the last line I wrote was, "They're changing her back." And I thought, that's cool. And I still have that piece of paper, and I framed it, and I have it on my wall in my office at home. Ideas don't generally come to you full-born like that, and this one did. It was great.
Who are you?
Tristan.
We used to have a thing we called bottle shows because in TV you're given a finite amount of budget and people watch that because they know that they are going to earn a finite amount of money on the shows. And what we would do, it's like a concertina. Some shows we'd pull it out and use more because we really wanted to use it. And other times we would squeeze in because maybe we'd run the more a little too often. And Quality of Mercy was a bottle show.
The classic bottle show is Dog Day Afternoon. If you look back at police shows, you'll see every police show would do a Dog Day Afternoon episode where the guy's holding up a bank and the whole show is set in the bank or in a wedding or something. They'd find some place to lock it all up in one room. That's a bottle show.
But it was a bottle show where the bottle, this jail cell, turned out to have more explosions and fireworks in it emotionally than many of the shows that we'd spent a lot of money on.
What's that? On your arm, show it to me. Show it to me!
The idea for Quality of Mercy was to do a small show, to do a drama, to do a play, if you will, because that was my background. I've been a playwright almost as long as I was a television writer. Not nearly successful, however.
It really was a theater piece.
Yes, sir.
In this case, I had Robert Patrick and Nikki DeBoer. Robert is an amazing actor. He has the unique combination of being able to sell action and strength, and at the same time understand the subtleties of emotion.
Robert Patrick, he was great. He was just terrific. He so embraced the story, so embraced the physicality necessary to tell the story.
I insisted first and foremost that if I was going to try to do this at the level that I wanted to do this, that we'd have a rehearsal day. So I had the actors for a day of rehearsal, and we just sat in a green room because the set wasn't ready yet.
And we did a read-through together in the morning, and I think in that day they got to bond in a way that, and Brad got to work with the actors in a way that you never normally can in television. I mean, you know what it's like. 12-hour days seemed like a long time, but when you're trying to commit 8 or 10 pages to film, that's very difficult.
And I just took it on as a responsibility that we weren't going to do take after take after take and try different things. We were going to commit right in this rehearsal room to what we were going to do and how we were going to do it.
But not mercy. I don't think there's a word for it in their language.
Brad Turner is one of the most extraordinary directors I've ever worked with. He's very soft-spoken, and yet he just thinks filmically. He absolutely sees scenes in his mind and he's just born to direct. He's a wonderful director, very, very good with actors, and I collaborated with him on a number of shows, both on The Outer Limits and in other series, and he's the best. Brad is a remarkable director.
For me, the challenge and quality of Mercy was to find a way to give the actors the time to find these characters, but at the same time meet the requirements of production, which was to try to do it in 6 days and get it done. And it's interesting how the money people and the producers always look at these things as, oh, this is in one room, there's 2 people, what do you take, 3 days or something for this? But if we travel with trucks from here to there, it's 8 days. Everything you see in that episode was specifically shot to be put where it's put. It wasn't a bunch of options, because we didn't have time for options. So we shot a scene a specific way, we cut it a specific way, and then moved on because we couldn't afford anything else. And I think that, in the end, made it a better episode.
We did some great prosthetic makeup, turning somebody into an alien, but it turns out not to be what it appears.
And Steve Gagan's set. I mean, the goal was to write an episode with 2 people in a room, and that was quite a room.
I wrote a very long memo about what aliens should be like, and that they should have to react to gravity, that they should have maybe a different timbre of voice because they were breathing gases that they weren't used to, that they might not see in our spectrums, that they might have different sensitivities or even different spatial auras, so that they could sense things before we did. And the idea was to really try and infuse reality into them. With Quality of Mercy, we felt that we had found something that we wanted to explore more, and on 2 or 3 occasions we did actually do extended explorations by adding another story or 2 stories in another season of the adventure of that particular story. And it was not something we did very often because we felt that it was, again, not our job to become serialized, but it was so potent that we felt that we really could go visit that territory again and say something fresh.
I've made a lot of television shows and a lot of episodes of television, and I think that you make some good ones and some bad ones, and you hope that somewhere in the course of your television career you've made one that someone will look back at, because people tend to do that in science fiction, and say, oh yeah, that was the one that he did. And I think that's probably in my career so far the one that still stands out.
Caught in the Act was something that we did because we wanted to do something that embodied what we thought The Outer Limits was, which was very scary, very provocative, thought-provoking, a little sexy. We wanted to kind of set the bar. That was our first season. We got Melissa Milano. She did an amazing job. And it was a really great episode because it had a mix of both really gruesome, bizarre, freakish stuff, and it was also kind of titillating, and it also allowed us to explore the edges with Showtime because we were on Showtime, so we didn't have to worry about language or nudity or anything else. And yet it also had a really sweet ending. It was really at the end about redemption and about these 2 people and the power of them coming together, which resolved itself, which was actually kind of an anti-Outer Limits type ending. It was not what you expected to see, so I kind of like that too. It wasn't just a flip and then she explodes and you never see her again. It's like there's a really nice, sweet, weird ending with this big butterfly floating up to the ceiling. So I like that too. What's really interesting about that show is you can see, I think, the progression of visual effects. Caught in the Act is a first season show. We're experimenting with visual effects still and how to use them. There's some things in there that I think I look at now and I kind of cringe at because it's not exactly what I would be doing today. But 7 years ago, it was also just at the forefront of a lot of different things, computer animation and compositing. Back then, a morph was still actually an interesting and novel thing. So there's stuff in that episode that I think is really interesting to track, especially if you go through and look at that show and the visual effects in that show, and then look at some of the later seasons. I think you definitely see a progression in terms of the quality of the visual effects, and that is definitely a function of less of money and more how much you can do with the money you have.
One of the joys of the first season was that I had elected to create a show, but the way I wanted to create a show was to actually be the person who didn't possess it. Now, this may sound totally wacko, because if Gene Roddenberry creates Star Trek, you think of him as being the mentor and the controller of all the things that go into the show, and you look at every question has to be directed to him. But I felt with a show like The Outer Limits that that was morally wrong. It wasn't my show. I didn't originate it. I was helping to bring it to a next level of an audience. But what I really felt was important was that I create an environment where great ideas win. And essentially what I set out to do was to create a think tank where people who had the same kind of speculative imagination that I have could come and bring their ideas, and that they would be in a community of other people who are trying to help them give their ideas strength and bring them to fruition. And I call those people story midwives. And the people who in our business are not sensitive to the creative arts are people who I call story Frankensteins, and they want you to rip the head off your child, stick another head on it, and they want you to pull one leg off and see if it runs better with one leg. And there are other people who are much more caring and aware that great ideas start off like tiny little children. If you shout at them, they go away. Sometimes you need to nurture something to pull out all the potential nuances. And so I call those people story midwives, because they're not trying to tell you what it should become. They just are urging you to have the strength and courage to give birth. And so I wanted to create a community of people who worked together, who didn't feel that anybody had any particular control, so that they didn't feel like their ideas were being taken and used by someone else, that they could actually stay on their shows. And so each of the individual guys who wrote scripts for us were then allowed to continue through with the scripts to the floor, to shoot it with the actors, to be around the whole process, so that they were able to take their vision and give birth to it. And I felt that was really important, because we're doing an anthology series where each individual show is vitally important, where there is no continuity of characters. Not like next week you tune in and see the same guy played by John Goodman appearing again. So it had to be the best show each week it could possibly be. And my thinking was, the only way you're going to get that is to free people to make it their show and not make it my show. And so I stepped back as much as I could and took a kind of a benign, encouraging position, and really was delighted to see the results. You know, shows like Caught in the Act, a friend of mine wrote from Canada, and I was surprised. I'd started it off with a little squib in the Bible that we'd written, and he took it and grew it into a giant seed, and it became a wonderful show. And there's a joy in seeing people achieve things that you could never achieve. It's exciting when you see creativity and it blows your own eyeballs out. That's fun. And so I got a great deal of pleasure from that first year, because the theory seemed to work.